the ramping up of a tax on wealth in this country, it's happening at an extraordinary rate. And it starts off as these attacks on quote-unquote billionaires. And then pretty soon the left realizes that there's not enough money with the billionaires to just attack the billionaires. Then it turns into an attack on millionaires. Then pretty soon it turns into an attack on people who make more than $500,000 a year. Then pretty soon it turns into an attack on people who make more than $200,000 a year. What you will see is that the bar for becoming rich in this country is going to continue to decline. Now, obviously, if you're a billionaire, a millionaire, somebody making $500,000 a year, you're doing fine. But the fact is that to support the kind of social spending that Democrats want, to support the kind of market regulations the Democrats want, tax rates don't just have to be high on wealthy people. They have to be exorbitant on people who are middle class, which is why if you go over to all the Scandinavian countries that the left loves to cite as socialist havens, even though they are capitalist countries with heavy social safety nets, if you go over to Norway, if you go over to Denmark, if you go over to any of the places that the left truly loves, massive middle class tax rates. High middle-class tax rates. Now, Bernie Sanders will tell you this. Elizabeth Warren will not. And Elizabeth Warren is getting away with lying about all of this by talking about her so-called wealth tax. Well, she's just going to tax the people who are the billionaires. It's going to be the billionaires tax. People who are worth $50 million and more, those people are going to experience a wealth tax. And if you look at the polls, this polls pretty well. Why? Well, because the natural human instinct is to say, well, those people have enough money. What's the big deal if we just take all their money? If we just take more and more of their, and it's not all of their money, it's 2% of their wealth every year. Why is that a big deal? Well, right now, I want to explain to you why all of that is a big deal and why this is a very stupid idea, why it's an unworkable idea, why it's a counterproductive idea, why it will actually hurt the economy for you, not just for billionaires, not just for people who are very wealthy, but for you. Okay, because the fact is that tax policy is intimately involved with the future growth of the United States economy. Now, the left seems to think that you can just run into wealthy people's houses, steal all their stuff, like every year do it, and that this is not going to have any impact on the American economy or the global economy, on investment rates, on tax avoidance. They don't seem to understand the elasticity in markets, that when you change the incentive structure for people, their behavior also changes, that if you seize wealth from people, the way that they behave changes, the way they invest changes, and that has impacts that ripple out beyond whether Bill Gates can buy his 100th car. And they seem to believe that you can just confiscate wealth and that wealthy people will act exactly the same, that it doesn't change the nature of the economy at all. It's a fixed pie, so if we just grab more from the rich people, what's the big deal? How does that affect anything? Okay, well, let's go through the wealth tax and let's talk about Elizabeth Warren's proposal. So first of all, let's distinguish a wealth tax from other kinds of tax. An income tax is based on the amount of income you make. I get a salary. I make a certain amount of income. I have a business. I take a certain amount of income. And now I pay a certain amount of tax on that income, right? There's graduated income tax rates. Once you get to the top tax rates, you're paying something like 35% in top tax. If you're in the state of California, you're paying 35% plus 12% is the top tax rate. And so you're paying a lot of money. You're paying a lot of money. And the talk of how people at the top of the income tax bracket are not paying a lot of money is just a lie, okay? The idea that rich people are not paying their fair share is absolutely untrue. Richard Epstein, who is a law professor over at University of Chicago, he says the fraction of total taxes paid by the 90% of the population has shrunk over the last 35 years, the bottom 90% of the population. So you keep hearing that it's the middle class bearing the burden of taxes these days. Absolutely false. Complete lie. 90% of the population, their tax burden has shrunk over the past 35 years from about 50% of the total tax burden to about 35%. That means 90% of the population is paying 35% of the total tax. Currently, about 40% of all total taxes are paid by the top 1%. Okay, so those 1%ers, those evil 1%ers, they're supporting 4 in 10 tax dollars. 4 in 10. Top 1%. And you say, well, maybe they have all the income. They don't. Okay, they're earning about 20% of the income. So they earn 20% of the income, the top 1%, and they pay 40% of the total tax burden. If you pile on top of that a massive wealth tax, that's a pretty big deal, especially because when you're talking about taxing wealth, you're not talking about taxing income. Okay, first of all, there's this lie that has to be debunked very quickly, which is that the people at the top are getting very wealthy and everybody else is getting poorer, and this is not true. As Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman, who are Elizabeth Warren's basically official economists, and they're not very good at their jobs, point out, the yearly increase in wealth for the top 0.1% between 1980 and 2016 has averaged about 5.3%. But the general average in the United States is 2.5%. So everybody has been increasing. It's just that people at the very top have been increasing than people lower down. Okay, so the question becomes, why is that innately a horrible thing? Right? Just because somebody is doing better than you doesn't mean that you are doing poorly. Stop looking over your shoulder at the guy who lives next door. As I've said before, if you own the mansion next door to Bill Gates, there's a tremendous amount of income inequality between you and Bill Gates. but you're still living a pretty good life. I mean, you're living next door to Bill Gates. I assume you're not living in a box, right? You're probably living in a very nice house right next to Bill Gates. Okay, so the difference between a wealth tax and the income tax is that the income tax is measured by your income. A wealth tax takes your entire asset base and then forces you to have that assessed every single year. And then they take 2% of your wealth base. So let's say that you are a business owner. You're not somebody who has cashed out of your businesses and you just have stocks. You're a business owner. Okay. In your business, it's an $80 million business. And you are the sole owner of that $80 million business. Now, does that mean that you're making $80 million a year from that business? No, it absolutely does not. It absolutely does not. Right? Because the fact is that if you own a business, the vast majority of the money in your business is poured back into running the business. But let's say that you own a business that is valued at $80 million. How would you value that? Well, maybe you value it by using a 3 times EBITDA, right? Earnings before interest and taxes, right? Let's say that you value it that way. And let's say that now that it is assessed at $80 million. Well, now you're going to have to pay presumably 2% of that amount. So you are paying, let's see, $1.6 million. $1.6 million to taxes. That could be your entire profit margin on that business, right, that you are paying. Because, again, you are valuing the wealth and then you are taxing the wealth. Okay, that's very different from you have a certain amount of stock and the stock is publicly traded and we know how much that is worth. And so we force you to liquidate some of that stock. Even that is a bad idea. Because, again, you haven't sold the stock. You haven't realized the gain. You haven't realized the loss. So imagine for a second that you have tons and tons of stock. And let's say that it's 2008 and the stock market has just plummeted. You haven't actually realized the value of the stock, right? You've taken a hit, but you haven't actually sold, right? Warren Buffett was once asked, how much money did you lose during the Great Recession? And he said, I didn't lose any because I didn't sell my stock, right? It's only a loss that is realized when you sell your stock. But according to the wealth tax, every single year, Warren Buffett's stock would have to be valued, and then you would take a portion of that value and you would assess that as a tax, even though he has not actually sold the stock, right? He's not actually realized any gain from the stock. It's just sitting there. But every single year, they would take a percentage of that value. Okay, how about your property? Your property would be reassessed every single year, and then, by what, Zillow? And then you would have to pay a percentage of what that property is worth, 2% per year. Okay, the same thing would go true for all of your other stuff, right? It'd be true for, let's say you own a painting. Let's say you own the Mona Lisa, and it's worth $50 million. Or is it worth $100 million? Who knows? Because at the upper end of the art market, there's a tremendous amount of vagary in terms of what things are worth. After all, there aren't that many buyers at the upper end of the market. So it could be worth 50, it could be $100 million. Well, that's a pretty significant difference in terms of what you're paying in tax. The costs of compliance on this sort of thing are extraordinary. This is why the estate tax, which, by the way, is immoral. The estate tax is immoral. The reason that it is immoral is because you paid taxes on this stuff your entire life, and just because you die and hand it to your kids, which was the purpose of you handing wealth, now the government pries open your safe and just takes your money. They walk over your dead body to take your money so your kids can't have it, even though you've paid taxes on that income your entire life. Elizabeth Warren is doing the same thing. It's confiscatory, right? You paid taxes on all of this income. You paid 35, 40% taxes. Right? I pay very high tax rates. At a certain point, presumably, I won't be running this business anymore, right? I'll retire. And then I'm going to have to pay taxes again for the sin of what? Having run the business and paid taxes for years and years and years on end? Right? On a basic moral level, this is immoral. But on an effective level, it's also stupid. The reason that it's stupid is because you know how much it takes to actually do the compliance with a liquidated wealth tax this way? You have to have every value item that you have assessed every single year. Now, in the case of the estate tax, maybe that makes sense. At least then, the estate taxes are like up to 40%, so the government is making a bunch of money, so it makes sense to force you to do all that stuff. But for a 2% total, as Warren is proposing, the amount of compliance that the IRS would have to check would probably cost more than the amount of money that they would get from the tax itself. This is what Richard Epstein points out. He says the administrative costs of imposing a 2% wealth tax on persons whose net worth is, say, $55 million would surely surpass the $100,000 the tax would generate. Just imagine how much it will cost the IRS to process 75,000 tax returns that Saez and Zuckman predict will be filed annually. Also, as Epstein points out, when you are very wealthy and then you don't take that money and you don't invest it, because why would you possibly invest it? Because they're just going to assess you and then they are going to take money away from you. So why wouldn't you just leave it in cash, presumably, or stock it in overseas assets or move overseas altogether? This would have an impact on GDP. It would have an impact. You're going to force people to liquidate their businesses. You're going to force people to sell their businesses. This happened in France. Rich people were forced to sell their businesses because the profit margin they were making from the business was not enough to outstrip the actual tax that they were paying from the business. So instead, they sell the business. Or let's say that you have a stock. Let's say that you're Jeff Bezos and you own a ton of Amazon stock. And every year, you're going to be forced to liquidate 2%, $2 billion worth of your stock, for example. So you sell it on the open market because you have to liquidate it to pay the tax. What do you think that does to the price of the stock? You're now flooding the market with Amazon stock. What do you think that does to the Amazon stock? It sends it down. You have now increased the supply without increasing the demand for the stock. So what exactly are you doing? You're lowering the price. Well, it turns out Jeff Bezos isn't the only investor in Amazon, guys. It turns out there are a lot of 401ks tied up in the stock market. As Richard Epstein points out, a 1% decline in GDP of $200 billion could largely wipe out the supposed revenue gain of the wealth tax. Most rich people do not idly count their wealth sitting under palm trees. They continue to reinvest it in new projects that require both equity and debt capital. When a wealth tax of $5 or $10 million comes due, it could require an entrepreneur to liquidate part of his business or to divert his assets from investment and business growth to the payment of taxes. And guys, this isn't speculative. I'm going to give you real world examples in a second of how the wealth tax has actually been a giant fail before. It was tried in France. It was a giant fail. David Andelman wrote for CNN about 42,000 millionaires left France between 2000 and 2014, according to the financial paper Les Echos. Many of them decamped to other countries like Belgium or Portugal, which boasts a flat tax of just 28% on income from interest in investment for expatriates and no wealth tax. Eugenio Carrera, a French accountant, pointed out to me that an estimated 15,000 French expatriates have taken up residence in Portugal, many of them eager to flee the French tax system. One French tax consultant, Eric Pinche, estimated that the wealth tax earned the government some $2.6 billion a year, but it cost more than $125 billion in capital flight every single year from 1998 to 2006. Because if you're rich, you know what you can afford to do? Move. You can't. Now, the way that Elizabeth Warren intends on stopping this is she intends on grabbing like 40% of your total wealth if you try to move. Which, by the way, you're now creating an economic Berlin Wall. We are actually going to confiscate your wealth if you leave. That's how you know you're running a crappy economy, is when you're saying to people, and if you try to leave, we're going to grab all your wealth. Yeah, that's pretty terrible stuff. You know, like this is the policy generally of dictatorships. And when dictatorships try to confiscate everybody's wealth, and then they're like, okay, and if you leave, we're going to grab all your crap, and you're not going to take any of it with you. That's bad stuff. That's bad. By the way, if you think billionaires can't see this coming, you are wrong. Okay, if Elizabeth Warren is elected, people will move the next day. Not like a year from now, not 2 years from now. They will all do it like now because they will figure the chances that Elizabeth Warren passes this sort of thing are not horrible. Now, it is unconstitutional. I mean, it is worth noting that the wealth tax is unconstitutional. The fact is that Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says that no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. In other words, if 30% of the population lives in New York, 30% of the tax money is supposed to come from the state of New York under the original Constitution. The income tax was an explicit exception, and that was passed in the 16th Amendment. One of the worst Republicans move in history, by the way. The 16th Amendment only passes because Republicans want tariffs. So they traded to the Democrats. We'll get tariffs and you get the income tax. The worst, just the worst deal since the trade of Lou Brock. It's just the worst deal ever. Wow. But here's the big problem, putting all of that aside. You think that rich people aren't going to leave? Okay, a study by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development found that past attempts to tax wealth, quote, frequently failed to meet their redistributive goals and encountered significant administrative problems. And again, the people who are most disadvantaged by this are actually not the people who own massive publicly traded companies like Zuckerberg or Gates or Bezos. The people who really get screwed are the people who own active businesses that are not publicly traded. Because then your business is assessed every single year and you can't defray the costs through public ownership. Meaning right now, Jeff Bezos doesn't pay all the bills. The investors, the shareholders pay all the bills. But if you are the sole owner of a large business, then you pay all the bills. You may not take a profit this year. You may take a loss this year, and you're still paying an exorbitant wealth tax on the quote-unquote value of the business. So what is this really about? It's very easy. This is really about class warfare. It's really about Elizabeth Warren playing this game where she pretends that the rich people are the villains in our society. And it's disgusting. I'm sorry. It truly is. Mark Cuban slammed Elizabeth Warren as well he should, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks. He had a whole tweet storm about Elizabeth Warren. He said, the reality for Elizabeth Warren is that this is as much to divert attention from her income and net worth as anything else. Other than Steyer, she's the wealthiest of all the Democratic candidates, by far. It's amazing, by the way, that nobody's pointing this out. How is it that we are now 8 months into the Elizabeth Warren campaign, and nobody has pointed out that she's worth $12 million? She is worth $12 million. Okay, so for all the rich people are ruining the earth. Okay, the difference between some people worth $12 million is that they've created a bunch of jobs. Elizabeth Warren has not created a job, so far as I'm aware, other than the job that she created at Harvard Law for herself by falsely claiming she was Native American, allegedly. Cuban says, according to her filings, she made $900,000 last year, which means her family earns more than 2 times the amount needed to be a 1%er. She paid 25.5% of that in taxes, which is less than the percentage I paid in taxes, 29.85%. By the way, that's because Mark Cuban is making some money off of his capital income investment. The fact is that last I checked, I think last year I paid a 48% effective tax rate. Mark Cuban says Forbes says her net worth is north of $12 million. That's being rich, filthy rich. I'm sure it's richer than she ever imagined she would be. Good for her. She earned it. It puts her millions above the threshold for being part of the richest 1% by net worth in our country. That is 100% right. Okay, Mark Cuban is correct. The fact that Elizabeth Warren is misdirecting to rich people are really bad. Yeah, lady, why don't you take a look in the mirror?